O God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable unto you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So, this week, because of the snow day, some things got messed up at the school for Carissa, but she was supposed to teach a continuing education class to the other teachers at the Marion School on Friday, but it had to be rescheduled. As most of you know, Carissa teaches ESL, so she teaches English to people who don't speak English. And as part of this continuing education thing she was doing, she was going to have this very clever idea. She was going to put up an educational video in Swedish and have the teachers watch it and hand them pieces of paper and have them answer questions, which were all going to be in Swedish. So the idea was that, people can see what it's like to be in a class and be given an assignment when they don't really know what is going on. And as I thought about that, reflected on that this week, as she told me about that, and I was thinking about our Bible passage from 1 Corinthians, I was thinking about how often it feels like that as Christians, even reading our own Bibles. You crack open this book, and I would venture to say that most of us own a Bible, right? I mean, there are, in America, 4.7 Bibles per household, roughly, and 2.6 people per household, which is 1.8 Bibles per person. So, on average, you own a Bible or two. I counted while I was sitting in my study here in the church, and I was like, oh, there are 22 Bibles in this room. So I guess I'm making up for some people. But there really are, in spite of the fact that most of us have at least one Bible, people don't necessarily use them. And part of the reason that people don't crack the Bible open, and maybe even the whole reason that people don't open up the Bible and read from it, is that people are often worried about not understanding it, I think. People think that it could be so hard or even impossible to understand because, maybe you have to specifically study it. We send our pastors to training schools and they learn it and then they can help explain it to us. But as I thought about this, that idea is quite contrary to some other movements in the history of our church, particularly from the Reformation, which is where our Presbyterian tradition comes from. In the Reformation, one of the big stated goals was to get the Bible into the hands of everyone, to have everybody have the chance to read it, because it was basically understandable. Most people can understand most of what's in there just by opening it up and reading. But since that time, we've seen a waffling back and forth all the time as to whether the Bible is something that anyone can understand or whether it's something you need special knowledge to understand. And that's gone on for centuries, and it will undoubtedly continue. On the one hand, most of the words, just the physical words in the Bible, can be understood by anyone with, 6th, 7th, 8th grade education. On the other hand, what I think makes the Bible hard for people is not the words, but the context of things. Because so often we miss that really easily, and it makes the stories not make a ton of sense when we don't know the context of them. Now, the easiest way to understand the context is to read the Bible and get to know it, and then you start to learn the context of things. But, that's another sermon for another day, so I don't want to crawl too far down that rabbit hole. Instead, today, I would like to talk about one of those Bible passages that you can easily miss the nuance of if you don't have this understanding of the context in which it takes place. And today's passage is one from Paul's letters, this passage we read from 1 Corinthians. And when I say the context, I was realizing as I wrote that, it would be, even if you understood that Paul is one of the earliest converts to Christianity, and even if you understood that this is a letter, and even if you know that this is a letter addressed to the church in Corinth, which is a city in Greece, even if you know all that information, this passage could still be pretty foreign to you because it's about something that is just so not relevant to our lives. Meat sacrificed to idols. What is that talking about? What is the context of that makes this a relevant thing to this church in Corinth? Even if you understood all of this stuff, there's a load of context that we're missing about this infighting in early Christian worshiping communities. So I want to take us back a little and just talk about the Roman Empire really briefly, because I think you need to understand that a little bit to get this passage. Now, the Roman Empire was the biggest world power during Jesus' day, one of the most powerful empires in history. Basically, all of North Africa and the parts that border the Mediterranean Sea, as well as the Middle East and most of Europe, especially Southern Europe, were under Roman control. And of course, you may also know that in the Roman Empire, they worshipped a number of gods, a large number of them, in fact. In going so far even as calling the emperor of Rome himself a god, or at least a son of a god. This is why a lot of the Romans got so upset about Christians talking about Jesus as the Son of God. Their reasoning on that is the Son of God is an emperor. And so if you're claiming Jesus is the Son of God, you're claiming Jesus is the emperor, which is treason. So he should be put to death. But regardless, the Romans didn't just worship the emperor, they worshipped a whole pantheon of these fictional gods and goddesses that they claimed to be real. You probably know most of their names: Jupiter, Pluto, Neptune, Mercury, Venus, Mars. There are even ones that don't have planets named after them. So there are a lot of Roman gods you'd be familiar with. Anyway, typically a lot of Roman celebrations 2,000 years ago, much like American celebrations today, revolved around holidays, right? I mean, that's when we get together, we celebrate, we do these things. And that is something I think we can resonate with. But of course, their holy days were for these Roman gods and not for the true God whom we worship. So here's what would happen. There would be a big party, a celebration, a holiday, and a lot of people would come to these festivals, including some of the Christians who were around. They'd go to the festival. You know, there's a party, you go to it. You would have the day off of work, and you'd go to the local temple, the local pagan Roman temple, and you'd hang out with people, and you'd eat food with them. Now, some of you who were listening to that carefully may have noticed that something in there didn't sound right. This part where the Christians would also go into the local Roman temple. Well, of course, that's where most of these celebrations were held. And that's because part of these celebrations was it being a religious feast, right? A holiday is a feast day, is a religious feast day, and the temple, if you're not aware, is a very specific type of word, right? A temple is different from another house of worship, because a temple is where a sacrifice is done. So you would go to these houses of worship, these temples specifically, where you'd make animal sacrifices, and that's where you'd have the party for the holiday. Now, in Judaism, which did have a tradition of animal sacrifice, once an animal was offered to God, it was burned completely. It was a whole offering, a complete offering. When you offered it up to God, you were giving something up, right? You're giving it to God by taking it, burning it, and letting that go to God, so you don't get anything out of it. But in Roman tradition, you gave up the animal by giving it to a priest who didn't burn it whole, but instead basically cooked it, and then all the people at the festival would eat it. Now, this seems a lot less like a sacrifice, right? Because a sacrifice means giving something up, and here, you're giving it up because people get to eat it, but it seems more like a potluck than a sacrifice, to me anyway. But either way, that's what would happen at these gatherings. Now there's the church in Corinth that Paul is writing to, and they would have these festivals in Corinth as well. And people in the church in Corinth were of three minds about these things. There were those people who chose not to attend them, right? Because the whole thing's a pagan festival, I'm just not going to go. And then there were those who attended. And among those who attended, there was further division. The second group of people who would go, but they wouldn't eat the food. And the third group who would go, and they would eat the food. See, for those who chose not to eat, whether they were going to the festival or whether they weren't, they chose not to eat because this food had been sacrificed to Roman gods for these Roman holidays. It was like the very definition of the practice of idolatry. Idolatry is, of course, the word we use to mean worshiping false gods. So these Christians have the basic argument that, if you're doing the same things as these people, and they're calling it worship, then you're worshiping. So if you're worshiping a false god, that's not good. You're engaging in idolatry. So you shouldn't do that. So many people in the church in Corinth were mad at the people who would eat at these festivals. But those who did had their own line of reasoning. They would go and eat this sacrificed meat, and their counter-argument was this. Yeah, but those gods aren't real. We know this. Those gods are pretend. We know we worship the true God, so we're not really worshiping. You can't be worshiping if you don't think it's a real God. So how can you take it seriously if you know it's not real or important? They just saw this as a chance to get together with their friends and neighbors, to eat some meat, and they didn't think there was anything wrong with that. Now, if the other people there happened to think it was some celebration for some pretend God, these folks didn't care. They didn't think they were turning away from God, but they weren't going to turn down a free meal either. They're just going to go and eat. Plus, in these times in Rome, procuring meat was expensive and very difficult, so the feasts were a good time to get a healthy, nutritious meal that otherwise they might not have gotten. So this is the controversy facing this ancient church in Corinth. There are the people who want to go and just do what everybody else is doing, eat the meat, know that it isn't real, and want to worship God. And then there are the people on the other side of things who want to abstain from doing what everybody else does and take part in just Christian celebrations. So I suspect out there are people thinking a variety of things. Some of you may be thinking, that's interesting. I wonder what I would do in this situation. Some of you know which of these arguments sounds more like you already. Some of you, after all the talk of food, are thinking about what you're going to eat after church. And still others of you are thinking, well, that's all well and good, but what on earth does this have to do with our lives today? And I will admit, I have preached on a great many things in the Bible, but it is very hard to think offhand of anything on its surface that has less to do with our lives today than this passage, because it is so absurdly granular and specific. And yet, at the root of this passage is a discussion of conflict in church. How often do fellow Christians disagree with one another on a topic? How to live, how to vote, how to dress, where to shop. Even as people in our book study talked about, today, what to eat. We can disagree about any of those things and much, much more. But in this passage, Paul gives us some amount of guidance that I think is timeless. That even if the problems of the passage have nothing to do with our lives, it's still helpful. In fact, even if this problem wouldn't have meant anything to other people in Paul's own time, I think the advice still is meaningful. At the beginning of the passage we read, right in verse 1, there's a catchy little phrase, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. That's how Paul sets up his argument. It's the solution to the problem he's going to present. Greek rhetoric sometimes works in this way, where it talks about the solution right away, then goes back to the problem, and then returns to the solution, reincorporating it. It's a good and clever way of writing, but I think sometimes when we read it, it just looks confusing. When Paul says knowledge puffs up, he doesn't mean that knowledge is a bad thing. He's not saying, it's going to make you cocky and you don't want knowledge, because that's bad. Rather, he continues in verse 1, he also says, all of us possess knowledge, and knowledge puffs up. So, he wants us to understand, though, what knowledge is supposed to do. Because he doesn't just say knowledge puffs up. He says knowledge puffs up, love builds up. So what he's telling us is that knowledge without love doesn't do anyone any good. So what he wants us to understand here is that love, particularly that love of God and love of neighbor, is the most important thing we can have. And so he supposes a scenario to those folks who are eating the meat at these festivals. He says to them in the passage we read, you guys are right. You know that these aren't the true God, so you know you're not worshiping when you do it. So we shouldn't be concerned about it. But if you eating this meat is harming your brothers and sisters in Christ, maybe you should think twice about it. In other words, Paul wants us to consider how our actions affect others, particularly how they affect the faith lives of others. Paul just wants to make sure that it doesn't become confusing for new Christians who might think that these folks who eat the food at these gatherings are worshiping false gods, or so they don't get confused and think it's okay to be a Christian and to worship these idols. I think one of the things that's difficult about this passage is not just the context in which it exists and getting our minds around this whole idea. But one of the things that's hard is I think this is one of those passages of the Bible that rubs against the message of our wider culture. American culture on the whole is very individualistic. I'm going to do what's right for me, and what's right for you is none of my concern. And so I think sometimes when we read this passage, we can read this section about people who are going to eat meat sacrificed to idols, and they decide, I know it's not real, I'm not worshiping, I'm just going to do it. I don't care what you do. And I think we can empathize with that argument. But this passage encourages us to actually consider the faith lives of others, to actually use our own habits and actions and lives as a reflection of our faith. What we do has a reflection on others too. We are supposed to be reflecting Christ to other people around us. And so Paul is encouraging us to remember that. How we are seen by others might change how those people believe. If people around us see that we are good, loving, kind, generous, helpful, and faithful, then they will think that Christians are good, loving, kind, generous, helpful, and faithful. If people around us see us as cruel, intolerant, vindictive, gossipy, and judgmental, then they will think of Christians as cruel, intolerant, vindictive, gossipy, and judgmental. And more, unfortunately, the most up-to-date research about what people who are not Christian think about Christians says that people outside the church see people inside the church in those negative ways. So that's something we need to think about is, are we sometimes in our own actions eating meat sacrificed to idols, as it were, showing people something that is going to discourage their own faith? I think that's why this passage from Paul has some resonance for us today. Even though it's about something that seems irrelevant, even though it's about something that is just not at all our experience, it can remind us that we should not be stumbling blocks on others' path to Christ. That we're supposed to embody the life of Jesus. So let us be thoughtful and knowledgeable, but let us above all other things be loving, and make our actions reflect the actions of the one who came to save us. Amen. Our next hymn this morning is number 372, I Then Shall Live. I invite you to remain seated as we sing that hymn.